Empires rarely attempt to rebuild what has already collapsed. But in the 6th century, one emperor believed the Roman world could be restored. Italy was no longer Roman. North Africa was no longer Roman. Spain had slipped beyond imperial control. For most rulers, these losses would have defined reality. For Justinian, they defined a challenge. If Rome still existed in Constantinople, then the Mediterranean should still belong to Rome. We are in the early 6th century. The Western Roman Empire has been gone for decades. Italy is ruled by the Ostrogoths, North Africa by the Vandals, Spain by Visigothic kings. The Mediterranean world that once obeyed Rome is now divided among successor states. But the Eastern Empire still governs from Constantinople. Its treasury functions. Its bureaucracy records taxes and law. Its armies remain disciplined and paid. For the first time since the collapse of the West, the empire is stable. And stability creates a dangerous possibility. The possibility that what was lost might be taken back. The first target of Justinian's restoration was North Africa. Once, this region had been one of the richest provinces of the Roman world. Its cities were prosperous. Its farmland supplied grain across the Mediterranean. Its ports connected trade between East and West. But since the 5th century, North Africa had been ruled by the Vandals. The Vandal Kingdom controlled Carthage, a city that had once served as one of Rome's most important administrative centers. From there, their fleets could disrupt shipping across the Western Mediterranean. To Constantinople, this situation represented both loss and vulnerability. The empire had surrendered one of its most valuable regions, and the power now occupying it was not especially large. The Vandal elite was relatively small, governing a much larger provincial population. Internal disputes had begun to weaken the stability of the kingdom. For Justinian, this imbalance created opportunity. If the empire could land an army, defeat the Vandal leadership, and secure Carthage, the entire province might fall quickly. And if North Africa returned to Roman control, it would demonstrate something the world had begun to doubt: that the Roman Empire still possessed the ability to reclaim what it had lost. Justinian entrusted the campaign to his most capable general, Belisarius. Unlike many Roman commanders of earlier centuries, Belisarius would not march with massive legions. The empire no longer possessed unlimited manpower. Instead, the expedition would rely on precision. A carefully assembled fleet carried the army from Constantinople. Ships transported soldiers, cavalry, supplies, and equipment across the Mediterranean. The goal was speed. If the army could reach North Africa before the Vandals fully organized their defense, the balance of the campaign might shift immediately. Belisarius understood that numbers alone would not decide the war. Coordination would. The fleet crossed the Aegean, then moved along the coasts of Greece and Sicily. Every stage of the journey required planning. Food had to be secured. Horses had to survive the voyage. Communication between ships had to remain intact. An expedition across open sea always carried risk. Storms could scatter the fleet. Supplies could fail. Enemies could intercept the crossing. But the greatest danger was delay, because the longer the Vandals had to prepare, the harder the campaign would become. Speed was the empire's advantage, and Belisarius intended to use it. Belisarius did not land directly at Carthage. Instead, the Roman army came ashore farther down the coast. This reduced the risk of immediate confrontation and allowed the expedition to secure supplies. Once the soldiers were organized, the army began its march toward the Vandal capital. The distance was not enormous, but the outcome of the campaign would likely be decided before the walls of Carthage ever came into view. Because the Vandal king, Gelimer, could not allow the Roman army to advance unchallenged. His forces moved to intercept the invaders. What followed was not a single massive clash. It was a sequence of engagements, miscommunication, unexpected movements, and rapid maneuvering shaped the battle. Belisarius relied on discipline. Roman cavalry units struck quickly, breaking Vandal formations before they could fully coordinate. The battle unfolded in fragments. Separate groups fought in different locations. Messages traveled slowly. Commanders made decisions with incomplete information. But gradually, the Roman advantage became clear. The Vandal army lost cohesion, and once cohesion disappears, defeat spreads rapidly. By the end of the day, the road to Carthage lay open. When Belisarius entered Carthage, he did not find a city destroyed by war. He found a Roman city that had changed rulers. Its streets were still organized. Its harbors still received ships. Its population still lived within the framework of urban life that had existed for centuries. The Vandals had governed the province, but they had not dismantled its foundations. For the people of the city, the arrival of the imperial army did not feel like the birth of something new. It felt like the return of something familiar. Belisarius understood the importance of this moment. Discipline was enforced strictly. Roman soldiers were forbidden to plunder. Markets reopened. Administration resumed. Officials began restoring the structures of imperial rule. The message was deliberate. This was not conquest. It was restoration. Within months, the Vandal Kingdom began to collapse. Its leadership fractured. Its armies lost coordination. Its remaining resistance weakened. What had once been one of the most powerful Germanic states in the Mediterranean disappeared with surprising speed. North Africa was Roman again. And Justinian had proven something many believed impossible. The empire could reclaim the West. Military victories alone could not rebuild an empire. Territories could be conquered, but order had to be reconstructed. For Justinian, restoration meant more than reclaiming land. It meant restoring the structure of Roman authority. Over centuries, laws had accumulated in layers. Imperial decrees, regional rulings, contradictory interpretations. The legal system of the empire had become vast, but increasingly difficult to navigate. Justinian decided to reorganize it. Teams of jurists gathered earlier imperial laws and began compiling them into a coherent framework. The result would become one of the most influential legal projects in history, the Corpus Juris Civilis. It was not merely a collection of rules, it was a statement. Rome was still capable of defining law for the civilized world. Across the empire, administrators, judges, and officials would now operate under a clarified legal structure. Authority became easier to interpret. Decisions became easier to enforce. In this way, Justinian was not only rebuilding territory, he was rebuilding coherence. And coherence is what allows an empire to function across distance. Law was one pillar of Justinian's restoration. Architecture was another. Constantinople was already the largest city in the Mediterranean world, but Justinian intended to reshape its symbolic center. Early in his reign, a massive uprising erupted inside the capital. It began as political rivalry between factions in the Hippodrome. But tensions escalated quickly. Crowds filled the streets. Government buildings were attacked. Large sections of the city burned. Among the structures destroyed was the great church of Hagia Sophia. For Justinian, this catastrophe became opportunity. Instead of rebuilding the church as it had been, he ordered something far more ambitious, a structure that would dwarf every church that existed before it. Architects gathered materials from across the empire, columns from older temples, stone from distant quarries, engineers experimenting with new forms of construction. The result was extraordinary. A vast dome rising above the city, seeming to float above light-filled space. When Hagia Sophia was completed, it did more than serve as a church. It projected a message. Rome still possessed the resources. the skill, and the confidence to build at imperial scale. By the middle of Justinian's reign, the empire appeared stronger than it had been for generations. North Africa had returned to Roman rule. Large parts of Italy were being fought over in a prolonged war against the Ostrogoths. The imperial court projected confidence. Law had been reorganized. Monumental architecture reshaped the capital. Military campaigns expanded Roman influence across the Mediterranean. For a moment, it seemed as if Justinian's vision might succeed, that the Roman world, fragmented since the 5th century, could actually be restored. But restoration carries a hidden cost. Every reconquered province required administration. Governors had to be appointed. Taxes had to be reorganized. Armies had to remain in place to defend new borders. Victory expanded responsibility, and responsibility stretched the imperial system. The empire that had survived through careful coordination was now attempting to manage a much larger map. The machinery of Constantinople still functioned, but it was beginning to operate at a scale it had never managed before, and scale has consequences. If Africa had been a swift victory, Italy would become a grinding war. The peninsula was not a frontier province on the edge of the Roman world. It was the historic heart of it. For centuries, Italy had been the political center of Roman authority. Even after the imperial court moved east, the symbolic gravity of Rome remained enormous. But by the 6th century, Italy was ruled by the Ostrogoths. Their kingdom was far stronger and more complex than the Vandal state Justinian had defeated in Africa. Cities were fortified. Regional elites commanded their own resources, and the Ostrogothic army could retreat, reorganize, and return to the battlefield again. This meant the campaign would not end with a single decisive victory. It would become a prolonged struggle for control. Belisarius advanced cautiously through southern Italy. Naples fell after a difficult siege. Soon after, Rome itself returned briefly to imperial rule. For a moment, it seemed that Justinian's restoration might proceed as quickly as the African campaign. But the peninsula proved far harder to control. The Ostrogoths reorganized their forces and launched counterattacks. Cities changed hands. Frontiers shifted. Supply lines stretched across the sea between Constantinople and Italy. What had begun as a campaign of restoration slowly transformed into a war of exhaustion. Italy was no longer simply a prize. It had become a battlefield where the limits of imperial power would be tested. Because conquest is fast, but control is slow. And every city the empire reclaimed required soldiers, gold, and time to defend. What began as a campaign of restoration slowly became something else. The Gothic War did not simply decide who ruled Italy. It devastated the peninsula itself. Cities that had survived centuries of Roman rule were drawn into repeated sieges. Rome changed hands more than once. Fortifications were damaged. Infrastructure collapsed. Fields were abandoned. Trade routes that had once connected Italian cities with the wider Mediterranean world began to fracture. Armies moved constantly across the landscape. Ostrogothic forces attempted to reclaim lost territory. Imperial troops struggled to maintain control over cities they had already captured. The conflict stretched year after year. What had seemed like a campaign to restore Roman order became a war that consumed enormous resources. Soldiers had to remain stationed across the peninsula. Supply lines stretched across the sea from Constantinople. Gold flowed outward to maintain armies and administration. And the longer the war continued, the more fragile Italy itself became. The region that had once been the political center of the Roman world was being exhausted by the very war meant to restore it. Justinian would eventually claim victory, but the victory came at a cost, because restoration had expanded the empire's borders, and every mile of restored territory required protection. Protection demanded soldiers, soldiers demanded gold, and gold demanded a system that could sustain the strain. The Roman Empire was expanding again. But the pressure on its machinery was growing with every campaign. Just as Justinian's restoration seemed to reach its height, an invisible enemy arrived. In the year 541, reports of a strange disease began to spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Ships entering imperial ports carried sickness with them. At first, the outbreaks seemed isolated. A port here, a city there. But within months, the infection began to move with terrifying speed from region to region. Constantinople soon became the center of the catastrophe. People collapsed in streets. Entire households disappeared within days. Markets emptied. Workshops fell silent. Homes were abandoned. The disease we now call the Justinianic Plague spread across the empire with devastating force. Modern historians estimate that millions died throughout the Mediterranean world. For the Roman state, the damage was not only human, it was structural. The imperial administration struggled to maintain its basic functions. Officials vanished. Tax revenues collapsed. Armies lost soldiers without a battle being fought. Ports still stood. Warehouses still stood. Cities still stood. But the system that connected them had begun to fail. Even Justinian himself fell ill. For a moment, it seemed possible that the emperor who had attempted to restore the Roman world might die before his project was complete. The empire survived. But survival did not mean stability, because plagues do more than take lives. They break systems. Trade slows. Administration weakens. Military strength fades quietly. The Roman Empire had survived war, rebellion, and invasion. But this enemy was different. It attacked the empire from within its own cities. The plague did not strike an empire at peace. It struck an empire already under strain. In Italy, the war against the Ostrogoths was still consuming men, money, and time. In the east, Persia remained a constant threat. Frontiers had to be guarded. Garrisons had to be paid. Ships had to move supplies across long distances. The Roman world Justinian had tried to rebuild was becoming more expensive with every year. This was the deeper danger of restoration. Success had enlarged the map, but it had also enlarged responsibility. Every province reclaimed by the empire required administration. Every city recovered from an enemy required soldiers to defend it. Every victory created another frontier to maintain. The machinery of Constantinople still functioned. Taxes were still collected. Orders were still issued. Armies were still commanded in the emperor's name. But the system was operating under increasing pressure. And pressure does not always appear dramatic. Sometimes it takes the form of delay. A shipment arriving too late. A garrison receiving too little. A campaign lasting longer than expected. One strain can be absorbed. Several at once begin to alter the balance of the whole system. This is how strong empires become vulnerable. Not because their institutions vanish at once, but because their institutions are asked to carry more weight than they were built to bear. By the end of Justinian's reign, the empire could still claim victory. North Africa had been restored. Much of Italy had been brought back under Roman rule. Imperial authority had been projected across the Mediterranean with a confidence unseen for generations. On the surface, the restoration had worked. The map looked stronger. The emperor looked triumphant. The language of Roman power had returned. But maps can conceal strain, because territory is easier to recover than to integrate. And integration is where costs accumulate. The treasury had paid for fleets, campaigns, garrisons, fortifications, administration, and reconstruction. The army had fought across multiple fronts. The cities of the empire had endured war, plague, and disruption. What Justinian restored in prestige, the empire partly lost in resilience. This is the paradox of his reign. The Roman Empire expanded, but expansion magnified pressure. The system survived. Yet it emerged from victory more burdened than before. It could still command. It could still legislate. It could still project the image of imperial permanence. But beneath that surface, its reserves had thinned. Its flexibility had narrowed. Its margin for error had become smaller. Justinian had proved that the Roman Empire could still expand. It could still conquer. It could still legislate. It could still build at imperial scale. But victory had left the system under strain. War had consumed its resources. Plague had thinned its population. Restoration had narrowed its margin for error. The empire still stood, but it was about to face a crisis far greater than the reconquest of the West. In the next episode, the Roman world will be tested by Persia, by fire, and by a force rising from Arabia that will change the history of the Mediterranean forever.